So last time we were talking about structs, and we were doing this example. I think that this was a good opportunity, I think, to learn a little bit about structs, but also it seemed like it was a good chance to review some things that we needed to review, including reading from a file and a little bit about pass by reference, pass by value parameters. But I think we are doing pretty well here. I think that we just need to finish the print data function and we'll be done. I think when we left last time, we were just talking about how we're going to write the print data function. There's something that's missing that I've been sort of hinting at through this whole process. And I think we're about to get to the point where we'll be stuck without it. So for print data, it's very interesting. Sorry, I'm just, trying to get things how I want them set up. Okay, I think we're good. All right, so for print data, basically we're just going to use a loop to print out each person. Any suggestions about how to set up that loop? So we use a for loop, a while loop. Doesn't matter. So I'm going to say that we should use a for loop, but that does present a problem, right? Oops. Okay, so that's basically my entire print data function. What are we going to do here? Any thoughts or questions or array size? What do you guys think? Would that work okay? Okay, so if we have maybe -1, no, not -1, because we've got I less than array size here, right? So if array size is 100, the last time we're going to execute this is when I is equal to 99, right? So that's not a problem. However, it matters for the size of the file. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Ben. Feel free to expound on that or not. But what I need to say here, how many elements are in the file? Right, okay, right. So, right, if there are 4 people in the file, so we just read those 4 people in our read data function and put them into our person list. What's going to happen then if we use array size as the limit in our for loop? We're going to print out 99 people, right? But 95 of them are going to be just a bunch of garbage. Does that make sense to everyone? Array size is not going to work there. Make an if statement to not print empty slots. Well, okay, that is a great question. How do we know if it's an empty slot? Oh, let me answer that, okay? There is no such thing as an empty slot, right? You can't have an empty slot in your computer's memory. There's always something in there. So, any suggestions? What do we need to know here? Well, what we need to know is how many people there are in the array, right? Can we figure that out? What are we going to do about that? I'm just going to put num people here because that's what we want, right? Can we use the end of the file for the loop? Well, at this point in this loop here, there is no file, right? There's just an array. Okay, so increment a counter while creating the array. Look at that. It actually turns out that we have already been doing that, right? We had to increment the counter while creating the array so we would know where to put the next person, right? But I mean, well, no, I mean, you're on the right track. The problem is that the print data function doesn't know anything about that variable, right? So here's the deal. Let's look at the big picture here. Let's look at main, right? What we have figured out is that in order for me to write my print data function, I need to know how many people there were read into the array, right? So the way we're going to do that, and again, now we're just looking at this from the perspective of main. Main is reading data and then printing data. What I'm thinking is, what I am concluding here is that in order to print the data, I need another argument. Okay, where am I going to get that information? Read data is going to tell me that information, right? How's that look? Does that make sense where I'm going with this? So inside read data, you know, some people might do that. I think it would be better to use a pass by reference variable instead in this case. The reason being that you know, read data is doing a lot of input. I think it reads better. It reads more clearly, like you know, English. Or this is step one, read data. This is step two, print data. I normally don't like to make something a value returning function unless that's all it's doing, is just returning that value. I think that usually ends up with more readable code. A lot of people would disagree with me on that. So it's, I guess I'd call it a personal preference, but my personal preference would be to keep it as a void function. So let's let's continue tracing. You know, we have a few things we need to fix up here now, right? Our read data function, we're going to have to add another parameter to it. And then maybe down here at the bottom of read data, we will say num people gets count. Okay. Any questions or comments so far? So they're setting it up in read data. So now print data, going to have to add a second parameter there. And then down, actually, I guess that's it. We're good now. Should num people be passed by reference with the ampersand? here or here? In read data? Okay, good question. Anybody else have any response to that? Should we make it a pass by reference? How many people think it should be passed by reference? Raise your hand. Or thumbs up, either one, whatever you can do more easily. Okay, all right. Looks like a significant proportion. So yes, that is correct. If that is not clear, again, I think I'm kind of emphasizing this a lot the last couple of days, but this is super critical that you understand why that ampersand has to go there. It's going to make your life really difficult if we keep going forward and that's still a little fuzzy. So try to get that worked out. If you're still a little fuzzy on it, you need to talk to me about it or something. Please just get that figured out. Okay, so I think that you know, we've been jumping around a little bit now, so we might have forgotten something. And I will need to update my prototypes, right? Here's a read data. Print data, which I haven't done yet anyway. Read person doesn't change. Okay, so now at this point, I think I am completely done, except I just have to write this print person function, which should be pretty straightforward. So I'm just, what is the type of my parameter going to be here? The struct type, that is correct. But tell me exactly what I need to type here instead of the question marks. There's our struct, right? So what's the actual type that's going to go here in the code? Famous person. Square brackets. Does that look right? So what does this mean that we're expecting? This is a declaration of an array, right? Do we want our print person function to receive an array of people? We have a no and a yes. Well, for print data, the print data function is printing the entire array, right? So we need the whole array. Print person is just printing a single person. So you don't need the whole array. Well, the print data function needs the whole array, and the print data function is going through the entire array. This is actually a key point here, so I'm glad we're talking about it. The print person function doesn't need to know anything about an array. It doesn't even need to know there is an array, right? The print person function just needs a person to print. So we do not want that to be an array. Is that clear to everybody? All right. No, sorry. That's That's why we ask questions, because then we get to clear things up. Well, that's why I ask questions sometimes too, because then I get to figure out what we need to clear up. Okay, so print person, let's look at this parameter. I can't remember if we've talked about this before. We may not have talked about this before, but, and we'll talk about this a lot more either later today or on Wednesday, so don't worry too much about this at this point. But when we pass a struct like this, even though this should be passed by value, right? Everyone, let me stop for a second. Any questions about why that should be passed by value and not passed by reference? We're not changing anything, right? We just need to have that information sent to us so that we can print it. However, when we pass a big struct like this, it turns out it's pretty inefficient to use pass by value. It's inefficient in terms of memory because we have to make an entire new copy of that struct, which could be quite big. But more to the point, it actually slows our program down because of the process of making the copy of that struct. Okay, so you don't need to really understand the reasoning there, as long as you understand that we're not going to pass structs by value. We're going to pass it by reference, not because of the usual reason for passing something by reference, but because it's more efficient. And then, so now it's sort of like an array, right? When we've got an array and we don't want it to be passed by reference, how do we fix that? We put a const in front, right? So we're going to do the same thing here. Okay, don't worry too much about that now. I realize there's a lot of information and rules to remember coming at you, so we're going to hit that again a little bit later. So this is just, think of this as a sneak preview. Okay, so print person is just going to be cout print me.id. Cout print me.diet. Cout print me.last name. Cout print me.first name. Cout print me.age. Cout print me.street. Oops, I'm using the wrong variable name here. Hold on to that question just for a second. Okay, and then let me just make this print me. Yes, yeah. Okay, so I think everything here should look good now. In order to use this set W. This set W is a formatting function that tells C++ what size field it should print the data in. So it's going to make it so that everything lines up. We can talk about that in a minute when we actually see the output, if it's not clear what's going on there. But basically, set with 15, for example, means whatever is being printed here, create a field of 15 spaces and print the last name within those 15 spaces. And by default, it's right justified. So that means it's gonna, everything is gonna line up on the right side. I think now I'm having mental block on that one, but we'll take a look at it in a minute. One thing we do need in order to use set width is we're going to have to pound sign include IO. Uh-oh. I've been having keyboard issues. I hope this isn't what's happening. Nope. IO manip. So I think we're ready to try this out. Let's make a prototype for print person. Okay, and then let's give it a try. Oops. There's our output, and hopefully that looks an awful lot like the input file did. All right, I didn't put the 0 in front of these, but that's okay. And like I said, oh, so yeah, that is interesting, actually. Like I said, it's right justified because I put that set width 15. So it doesn't look exactly like it did here. But we're going to go with that for now. Not a big deal. Okay. Don't worry too much about the formatting stuff. This is covered in the textbook. I think it might be section 3.8. I don't know why I would remember that, but it's the section about formatting output in case you need it, or you can just look it up in the index, of course. Okay, any questions about this example, about structs in general? Where did print me come from? So here's where I declared print me. And so if you're asking where the argument is that is associated with this parameter, that would be back in print data right here. I said print person list sub I. So the first time through this for loop, I'm going to be saying, I'm going to be passing the first struct in the array. And the second time through this for loop, I'm going to be passing the second struct in the array, and so on. Okay, so that's good. Any other questions? Okay, so we are going to be doing a complete change of direction here. I am done talking about structs, and so we're going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about classes. I'm going to take a 5-minute break right here because there's just a few things that I need to get set up for that. So I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so let's talk about classes. Oop, let me put my headphones in case I need to hear you. We will use the so Joseph asked about going over the what I called the dereference and then select operator. I think I'm going to say we're not going to need that for at least a couple of weeks, and when we do need it, we will have a chance to talk about it again. So I think I'm going to say that it will be better to hold off on that if that's okay. You can live without it for now. Okay. All right. So we're going to be talking about classes. And so really what we're doing now is we are starting to talk about object-oriented programming. I'm so distracted by the fact that on my screen, oh, I understand what's happening. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm back now. I don't know why this keeps going. Okay, so object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming is pretty, conceptually, it's interesting. I don't want to say hard or challenging, but it's interesting. There's a lot of concepts. It's a fairly abstract concept. There's going to be some words that we're going to talk about that you're going to need to be comfortable with, such as encapsulation, abstract data type, and then the word itself, of course, object-oriented programming. What are all those things? What do they mean? We will get to that. But in my opinion, for most students anyway, it's usually better to start with the concrete and then move towards the abstract. So rather than trying to define these words right from the start, I'm going to just introduce class in a very concrete way. And then once we have a pretty good handle on classes, then we'll talk about how they are related to these more abstract concepts. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce a class as a way to define a new type in C++, but a more powerful way than we did with structs. Okay, so using structs, we learned how to create a new type in C++. We're going to be doing the same thing with classes. We're just going to see there's a little more power to a class than there was with a struct. Okay. So let's take as an example, let's take a software company that is working on a project that involves a great deal of processing with dates. So usually the first thing that comes to mind for me would be maybe some sort of an accounting software where you need to keep track of when a bill is due, or when a deposit was made, how long the deposit has been there, so you can figure out how many, how much interest is owed. So anyway, in a case like that, it would be nice if we didn't have to always pass around 3 variables to keep track of each date, right? Instead of having a variable for the day, a variable for the month, and a variable for the year, it'd be nice if we could just have one variable that represented a date. And now we could do that using a struct, but I'm going to choose to do it using a class, because we'll see why in a few minutes. Okay. So just a little terminology first here. If we assume that I have a new type called date, then the point is that later on, I'm going to be able to say things like date 1, date 2, declare objects of type date. When we have a class and we declare a variable to be of that type of that class, we call it an object. Okay, it's still a variable. But it's also a special kind of variable called an object. Okay, if the term object freaks you out, sometimes that happens when you're just learning a new concept, right? Most of the time, it's going to be safe if you just substitute the word variable in your mind, right? So if I use the word object, just think to yourself, oh, that's just a fancy kind of variable. Okay. Okay. Let me digress just for a second and point out that we have actually been using classes since the first week of this class. We've been using the string class, right? So we saw that with a string class, it's a little different from other kinds of primitive variables because I can say things like, I can put a dot after it and call a function that is a member of the class. Okay, so we have been using classes all along. All we're going to be doing now is learning how to create our own classes. That's the difference. Okay, in this example right here, and this is some terminology that is super important. I'm going to be using these terms over and over and over again. So we really need to know what they are. This object in front of the dot is called the calling object. Because what we're saying here is that the object stir1 is calling this function, right? So stir1 is the calling object. All right, I think that's it for that. When we have a program that uses a class, we call that program a client of the class. Okay, so in one sense, every program we've written that has used the string class has been a client program because it's been a client of the string class. Normally, we wouldn't care about that. Typically, when we use the term client program, it's when we're trying to distinguish it from a class. So if we're writing a class and we're writing a client program sort of at the same time, we can distinguish. Here's the client program. Here's the class definition or declaration. Okay, so you'll hear me use the word client program. That's just a program that's using a particular class. All right, I'm going to stop there with the terminology, and I'm going to try to actually get down to some concrete code. So when we declare a class, we start by listing all of the components that objects of that class will have. So that's pretty much like a struct, right? So I'm going to say class date. So what data does a date object have? Okay, I'm going to need a day. I'll use an int to store the day. Month, day, year, right? So I'll use an int to store each of those. Okay, good. So let me just digress for a minute. I'm doing the opposite of what I said. I'm talking a lot about abstract stuff here, but let's just talk about something that's super, super important just for a minute here. And that is, that's not the only way I could implement a date, right? I could choose, there's a lot of different ways I could choose to implement a date. Anybody have any other suggestions what I might do instead of this? Whether they make any sense at all or not. I mean, let me rephrase that. Whether they are better than this or worse than this, I don't care. Just other options that we might consider that we could use. Month, day, year with strings, right? So I could have, the day could be a string, the month could be a string, the year could be a string. Or the day could be an int, the month could be a string, February, for example, and the year could be an int. Apply it to an array. I guess we could use an array with 3 elements, right? So yeah, I said I don't think that would be very useful, but I said it doesn't have to be useful to suggest it. We're just brainstorming here, right? So yeah, we could use an array with 3 elements. The first element's the day, the second element is the month, the third element is the year. What about just a single string with the whole date in it? Could we do that? Would that work? Sure, yeah, why not? How about just, what if I just said it was going to be a single int that was the number of days since the year 2000, since January 1, 2000. How about that? Would that work? Gross, but yeah, that would work. Okay. Interestingly, in real life, that's very often how dates are stored. It's typically, if I'm remembering correctly, the number of days since January 1, 1970. And that actually turns out to be a very effective way of storing dates because it's very easy to do the math, right? Like if I need to know how many days this money has been sitting in this savings account, I just subtract the current day minus the day it was deposited. Done, right? If I'm storing a date as day, month, year, figuring out how many days are between 2 dates is going to be a lot more complicated. So all of that discussion is just to say there are often going to be different options about how to implement a particular class, and probably I'm gonna go out on a limb and say the most important thing to get out of this entire semester is the concept that we are trying to separate how we implement a date from what the date class actually does. So the specification of the date class from the implementation of the date class. Super critical concept. Whoa. Okay, so if that doesn't make 100% sense right now, that's okay. This is one of those things we're going to be circling around many times as we go, but super, super important concept. So the point there is, I'm going to write my entire date class. I'm going to have a bunch of different client programs that use my date class. And then I'm going to say, okay, I want to change how I implemented my date class. Instead of having 3 ints, I'm just going to have 1 int. Then I can make that change in my date class. It doesn't affect any of my client programs. My client programs all still work fine because they didn't know anything about how the date class was implemented anyway. They only know about the specification of the date class. So that's probably a little hard to understand at this point since we haven't seen enough, but consider that a sneak preview, I guess. Okay, so those are our 3 data members. Lots of new terminology here. These are the 3 data members of our date class. But in addition to these 3 pieces of data, a date object should also have functions that it can call, right? So like string objects have functions that they can call. They can call substr, they can call length, and so on. So for a date class, what kinds of functions might we want to include in a date class? Any ideas about that? Order. Not sure what order means. Get date, like order of how they're displayed. Okay, so you could have a function that controls the default of how the dates are displayed. Okay, set date. So we want to have some way of being able, in our client program, we want to have some way of being able to set a date to a certain date, right? That makes sense. I'm going to go with that one. So if I have a set date function, that's going to need some parameters, right? It's going to need to know the month and the day and the year. Okay, set event, that could work too. Set, someone just had something else up there that was actually a really good idea. But I'm kind of picking and choosing which ones I'm going to actually use here. Set date is one I'm going to use. I'm going to actually have one called read date. Read date is going to have no parameters because I'm just reading something from the user that the user types and using that to set the value of the calling object. Okay, that might be a little confusing at this point. Bear with me for just a minute. One more thing I'm going to want to be able to do, I'm going to want to be able to print a date. Okay. So as you can see here, I didn't say this. I demonstrated it instead, but to be clear and explicit, the way that you list the members of a class is by using declarations, right? So the data members are just simple variable declaration. The member functions are prototypes, right? Those are function declarations. So these are all declarations. And these functions, these member functions are going to have to be defined someplace, but we haven't done that yet. And then just to be clear, just like with structs, we're going to have a semicolon at the end. Very common source of errors that are hard to track down is forgetting that semicolon, so don't forget about that. So just to be clear what's going on here, in my client, I think I'm going to delete all of this stuff. In my client, I could say something like date 1.set for 27/1947. See out date 1 should be 4/27/1947. Date 1.print. So this is just just to be clear, I'm just writing a little tiny client program here just to sort of illustrate what these three member functions that I've listed should do, or what they look like when you call them from the client. Okay, so you can see here, date 1.set should set date 1 to 4/27/1947, then date 1.print should print 4/27/1947, then read a date from the user and then print it out. Any questions about how these functions are getting called here? So let me just point out again, and this is going back to the part about separating the implementation from the specification. Okay, these guys here, the member functions, that's part of the specification, right? In order for my client program to work, the client program has to know what the member functions are that are available. Okay, but notice that none of the stuff I'm doing in my client needs to know anything about these three data members, right? If I were to change it so that there was just one integer that represented the number of days since January 1, 1970, everything would still work fine. Okay, so what's left is we need to now actually define each of those three functions. But let me just say one more thing about the class declaration before we move on. Note that just like with structs, this is not actually a variable yet, right? So we're not actually creating or allocating any memory yet. We're just setting up this sort of blueprint so that we can later on declare variables of type date, which is what we do here. Okay. All right. So in order to enforce this separation between the implementation and the specification that I'm talking about, we're going to put the word private right here. What that means is not only are my client programs not supposed to know anything about day, month, and year, but we're not going to allow them to, right? A client program that uses this class is not allowed to access those three data members. However, they are allowed to access the member functions, right? So I'm going to put the word public there for the member functions. Okay, and then my habit is to actually put the private part at the bottom of the class, just because that sort of emphasizes the fact that you know, if a client programmer is looking at this class, they should be looking at this part, not this part. So I kind of try to hide it away at the bottom, in a sense. Not a huge deal either way, just my preference. Any questions about public and private? So what that means is down here in main, if I tried to say date 1 dot year gets 1987, that would give me a syntax error because of this word private. And that's good. That's what we want, right? We don't want the client program to be able to access year, because if the client program can access year, that means that if we were to change the implementation later on, everything would stop working, right? So another way to explain what we're doing here is, remember when we talked about functions and I said that the point of functions is we want them to be independent and self-contained. Well, they are sort of independent and self-contained, but not totally, right? There's no way to make functions so that they are really completely independent. With classes, that's what we get. Now we have something that is really completely independent and self-contained. I can write my class, I can compile it, give the compiled code to the client programmer. They use it. They don't know anything about what's in the class other than those 3 lines right there. Okay. As a matter of fact, these 3 lines right here, the prototypes of the member functions, we call that the interface, because it's the only part of the class that the client program needs to know about, right? So the only way that the client program can do things with dates is through those three member functions. And so they're called the interface between the client program and the class. Okay, so let's actually go ahead and write these three functions now. We're going to write them outside of the class declaration. It's actually possible to write the definitions inside the class itself, but we're not going to do that. And in this class, there's actually a style convention that says not to do that. We're going to keep them separate. That's all part of keeping the implementation separate from the specification. So let me work on set date. Okay, now there's one, actually, let me change those here too. There's one thing that's going to be a little different here than usual, because what we want here is we don't want just a basic global function called set date, like all of the other functions that we've been writing so far. What we want here is we want a set date function that is a member of the date class. So the way we say that in C++, date : in front of it, that means this is not just a general function the way we've been writing them. And we haven't used this term before, but it turns out that all of those functions we've been writing, they have all been global functions, right? Because we've declared them at the top of the file. We've been able to call them from any place in the file. So they've been global functions. We don't want set date to be a global function. We want set date to be part of the date class. And so this is how we say that. This operator right here, the : operator, is called the scope resolution operator. Okay, so that might seem kind of confusing why we would call it that. But basically what we're saying now is scope is a new word, I guess. But so far we've had two different kinds of scope. We've had global scope, which means that an identifier can be accessed from anywhere in the file. Or we've had local scope, which has meant we have a variable that can only be used inside a function. Global scope or local scope. We are introducing a third kind of scope here called class scope. So a function can be either a global function, actually I guess a function, let me rephrase that. A variable, an identifier, either a variable or a function or whatever. There are three options for the scope. It can be global scope, it can be local scope if it's just inside a function, or it can be class scope, which means it belongs to a particular class. Okay. So a lot of this, I'm going to digress just for a second here, because I sense that there's a lot of, I'm talking about a lot of kind of abstract concepts here. I want you to know that if a lot of the abstract stuff seems a little bit fuzzy at this point, that's okay. What you really need to know at this point is just follow the pattern, right? When you go to write your own class, you're going to say void, and then what goes here is the name of your class, : and then the name of the function. As long as you've got that syntax down and you can copy the pattern, you're okay, at least for now. Eventually, you'll want to have a deep understanding of this scope resolution stuff, but that can come with time. Okay, so setting the date just means I'm going to say month gets in month, day gets in day, year gets in year. And so the key thing here is when I say month inside of a member function of the date class, what I mean is the month data member of the calling object. Okay, same thing with day, right? Anytime I use a data member inside a class member function, I mean that data member of the calling object, right? So this probably looks a little funny. I've got this variable here, month. It looks like it's an undeclared variable, right? There is no month declared anywhere in this function. But what it means is because this function is not a global function, because this function is a member of the date class, I can use any of the data members of that class inside the function. And when I do, it means that data member of the calling object. So right here, when I say date1 dot set, sorry about that. When I say date1 dot set, okay, date1 is the calling object. So up here in the set date function, I just realized that I shouldn't call that set date, I'm just calling it set. Inside the set function, if I say month, that means the month data member of date1, because date1 was the calling object. Okay, but it doesn't necessarily always mean the month data member of date1. On the next line, if I said date2 dot set, then up here, when I call it the second time and I say month gets in month, in that case, month is going to be the month data member of date2 because date2 was the calling object. Okay, so to put this one more way, in a sense, you can think of the calling object as being an additional parameter, right? You have access to the calling object just the way you would if it was a pass by reference parameter. The only funky thing is you don't actually have to say the name of the parameter. You just say the word month, and that means the month data member of that sort of implicit parameter. In fact, sometimes computer scientists will refer to the calling object as an implicit parameter. It's a parameter, but you don't actually see it there in the code. Anybody want to ask a question at this point? I've been talking for a long time. Hope you're still all there. No questions or comments at this point. I realize this is a lot. Don't worry, we'll be doing this a lot. Okay, I think that's it for set. Let me go ahead and do print now, because if I do print, then we can actually test this. Right, I sometimes forget that you guys have actually done some stuff with classes in the past. I suspect this is, well, anyway. So, right, I'm used to teaching this to people who've never seen a class before. And so hopefully that's good. It'll make this easier. So print is just going to be cout month, day, year. Okay. Important note, actually, maybe not all that important, but geez. Notice that I'm not doing an indel here. Okay. I want to keep my print function general enough, just print the date and nothing else. So that, for example, if I was writing a client program where I didn't want to do a new line right after the date, I would be able to have that option. Okay, so I think we actually have enough here so that if I just don't do the last half of this client program, we actually have something we can test. Okay, when you're writing a class, that's actually a pretty good strategy. Start by just writing an output function and a function that allows you to give a value to an object. And then you can just test those two things, make sure they work. And then you can just sort of incrementally start adding one member function at a time. Let's give this a try. I'm sure that I forgot something here. Now let's see. Out of one. Oh, because I said print date. Okay, there's really no reason to include date in the name of the function because these are members of the date class, so it's already clear what it is that would be being printed or read. Declare private year. Oh yeah, I forgot to take out. So this is a good demonstration right here. It says error, year is a private member of date. So remember, I put this in here to explain what I could not do because of the fact that the year data member was private. So take that out now, and I think we should be good. Oops. Make sure I got that right. Date one should be 4/27/1947 for, did I say that? 4/27/1947, and there's my 4/27/1947. So apparently we have our set function and our print function are working correctly. And so on Wednesday, we will start by writing the read function. And then basically I'm 90% of what I'm going to do from there on out in terms of classes is just going to be some more examples. I'm going to start adding some more member functions to the class so we can just kind of play with it and see classes in action a little bit. Any questions before we go?